one of the most secure prisons in Britain, a prison built to hold some of the most dangerous men from one of the darkest conflicts in modern history, a place surrounded by fences, watchtower, locked gates, armed tension, and decades of bloodshed. And yet, on a cold December morning, a prisoner was placed inside a van for a normal visit. Seconds later, three men crossed the roof, entered a restricted area, and carried out an assassination inside the prison itself. The man in the van was Billy Wright, a feared loyalist paramilitary leader, a prisoner under the protection of the state. And the question that followed his death was simple. How did this happen inside the maze? Was it a conspiracy? Was it collusion? Or was it something almost as disturbing? A chain of failures, so serious that a man was left exposed in a place where he should have been untouchable. This is the story of the Billy Wright Maze prison assassination, and it begins long before the morning he was killed. To understand this case, you have to understand the place where it happened. HMP Maze was not an ordinary prison. It sat in Northern Ireland during the final years of the Troubles, a conflict that had already left deep wounds across communities, families, police forces, prisons, and politics. Inside the maze were prisoners from rival paramilitary groups, Republican prisoners, Loyalist prisoners, men who come from organizations that were not just criminal groups, but armed movements tied to politics, territory, identity, revenge, and fear. The prison was famous for its H blocks, long concrete wings, separated compounds, prisoner organized by faction, and a system where the prison authorities were not just managing criminals, they were managing enemies. That is what made the maze so different. In most prisons, the danger is individual. One prisoner has a problem with another. One fight begins, one argument turns serious. But inside the maze, danger had structure, danger had flags, danger had history, and danger had memory. If one prisoner belonged to the wrong group and another prisoner belonged to the opposite side, the treat was not random. It was political, it was personal, and it could follow a man even behind locked door. By the late 1990s, Northern Ireland was moving toward peace, but peace was fragile. Some groups supported ceasefires, others rejected them. And inside that tension stood Billy Wright. Billy Wright was the leader of the Loyalist Volunteer Force, known as the LVF. He was not just another prisoner, he was a name that carried fear, anger, and controversy across Northern Ireland. To his supporter, he was seen as a loyalist figure. To his enemies, he was a dangerous paramilitary leader. To the authorities, he was a high-risk prisoner in a very high-risk environment. At the time of his death, Wright was serving an 8-year sentence. He had been convicted of doing an act with intent to pervert the course of justice and making a threat to kill. Inside prison, his status made him a target. He was not just vulnerable because he was a prisoner. He was vulnerable because of who he was. He had enemies on more than one side. And one of those enemies was the Irish National Liberation Army, known as the ENLA. The ENLA was a Republican paramilitary group. The LVF and ENLA were on opposite sides. They were hostile. They were not on ceasefire, and according to the inquiry, the antagonist between them was well known. That detail mattered because Billy Wright and ENLA prisoners were not separated by miles. They were not even separated by different prisons. They were placed inside the same H block. Different wings, yes, but the same block. And from that moment, the clock was already ticking. Billy Wright was moved from McBurry prison to the maze in April 1997. At first, this may sound like a basic prison transfer, but in this story, that transfer became one of the biggest questions because once Wright arrived at the maze, he and other LVF prisoners were held in H Block 6. ENLA prisoners were also held in H Block 6. The LVF were in Wings C and D. The ENLA prisoners were in the Wings A and B. On paper, they were separated. In reality, they were close enough for risk to become real. The inquiry later examined this decision in detail because this was not a normal housing decision. There were opposing paramilitary factions. The threat was known. The atmosphere was explosive, and the prison itself had a duty to keep every prisoner safe, no matter what that prisoner had done. That is one of the most important points in this case. Billy Wright was not innocent of paramilitary life. He was not a harmless figure. But when the state locks a person in a cell, the state becomes responsible for that person's safety. That is how lawful custody works. A prison sentence is not supposed to become a death sentence, and the maze was supposed to be secure. That is what makes what happened next so shocking. Before the assassination, there were warning signs. Not one warning, not one vague rumor, a pattern of danger. The inquiry later looked at concern about housing the LVF and ENLA in the same H block. It examined the security of H block 6. It examined visit lists. It examined van movement. It examined watchtowers. It examined camera. It examined how prisoner got access to a restricted area. And it examined how firearms end up inside the prison. Each of these details sounds technical, but together they form the heart of the story, because assassinations inside secure prisons do not happen because of one mistake. They happen when many weaknesses line up at the same time. A missing check here, a broken camera there, a poor decision somewhere else, a dangerous routine left unchanged, a warning treated as a background noise, and then one day the people planning an attack see the opening. In H Block 6, the opening was physical. A hole had been cut in a wire fence behind the ENLA wings. From there, prisoners could reach the roof. And from the roof, they could reach the forecourt area. That forecourt was where prison vans moved prisoners to ward visits. In a secure prison, that route should have been controlled. But on the morning Billy Wright was killed, the route became the path of the attack. It was Saturday, 27 December 1997, just after Christmas. Inside H Block 6, normal prison routines were moving. Billy Wright was due to go to a visit. He was placed in a prison van with another LVF prisoner and a prison officer escort. The van was in forecourt of H Block 6. This should have been a controlled movement, a prisoner going from one area to another, a normal part of prison life, but somewhere inside the block, the ENLA prisoners were ready. Christopher McWilliams, John Kenway, John Glennon, they had access to weapons that should never have been inside the prison. They had a route, they had timing, and they had a target. According to the inquiry, the attackers made their way from their wings to the forecourt by climbing over the roof of A wing. A hole had already been cut in security fencing. Once through, access to the roof was comparatively easy because the blocks were single-story structure. Think about that for a second. This was the maze, a prison known for holding high-risk paramilitary prisoners, and yet a cut fence, a reachable roof, and a vulnerable van movement created the opportunity for a prison assassination. The attackers reached the forecourt. Billy Wright was inside the van. There was no dramatic escape routes, no open battlefield, no public streets. just a prison van inside one of Britain's most secure jails. Then the attack happened. Billy Wright was shot several times. He died while in lawful custody. And instantly the question was bigger than who pulled the trigger. The bigger question was, how were they allowed to get close enough? After the assassination, Northern Ireland braced for consequences. Billy Wright was not an ordinary prisoner. His death had political weight. It had paramilitary weight. It had emotional weight for people connected to the loyalist world. And it had danger written all over it. In the weeks that followed, there were retaliation killings. The inquiry later noted that 10 people were killed by the LVF or the Ulster Freedom Fighter in the period after Wright's murder. That is why this case cannot be treated as only a prison killing. It was a prison assassination with consequences outside the prison walls. A man was killed inside custody, then more people died outside. The prison failure became a public safety crisis, and almost immediately people began asking questions. Why were the LVF and ENLA in the same H block? Why had the fence not stopped the attackers? Why was the roof accessible? Why was the van positioned where it was? Why had a camera not been repaired? Why was an observation tower not properly watching that area? How did guns get it inside? And why did so many things fail on the same morning? Those questions created something even bigger, the suspicion of collusion. Whenever a high-profile paramilitary figure is killed inside a state prison, suspicion grows fast. And in Northern Ireland, suspicion did not come from nowhere. The Troubles had created decades of mistrust. There had been previous allegations involving intelligence, informers, police failure, prison failure, and hidden files. So when Billy Wright was killed inside the maze, many people did not accept a simple explanation. They believed there had to be more. Some believed the state had allowed it. Some believed people in authority knew a plot was coming. Some believed the prison system had looked the other way. The inquiry was later asked to examine whether any wrongful act or omission by prison authorities or other state agencies had facilitated Wright's death, or whether his death was linked to collusion behavior. That word matters. Collusion. It is one of the most serious accusations that can be made in a case like this. It does not mean simple incompetence. It means people in authority secretly helped, allowed, encouraged, or knowingly failed to stop a killing. And for years, this case lived under that shadow. A prison assassination, missing or poor records, security gaps, a broken or malfunctioning camera, an observation tower issue, a dangerous prisoner movement, firearms inside prison, a target with known enemies. Even if each detail had an innocent explanation, together they look terrible. And that is why the inquiry becomes so important. The Billy Wright Inquiry took years. It cost millions. It reviewed documents. It examined prison decisions. It examined state agencies. It studied the timeline before the killing. It looked at the intelligence picture. It looked at the prison layout. It looked at who knew what and when. And its conclusion was complicated. The inquiry did not say everything was fine. Far from it. It identified serious failing. The official government statement after the report said Billy Wright was in the protective custody of the state when he died. It said his murder in a high-security prison should never have happened. It said failing in the system facilitated his murder. That is a powerful phrase. Facilitated his murder. Not planned it, not ordered it, but created the conditions that made it possible. The inquiry pointed toward failure in the management and running of the maze. It accepted that prison staff were working under extreme pressure in an extraordinary environment, but it also made clear that this did not erase the failure. At the same time, the report rejected allegation that the state colluded in Billy Wright's killing. So the final picture was not the clean answer some people wanted. It was not a simple conspiracy. It was not a clean exoneration of the system either. It was something colder. A man under state protection was left vulnerable. His enemies exploited that vulnerability, and the system failed at the one thing it had to do: keep him alive. Even after the inquiry, this case still feels uncomfortable because some questions are unanswered, but not all questions feel emotionally settled. We know who carried out the attack. We know the attackers were ENLA prisoners. We know Billy Wright was inside the van. We know the route involved a cat fence and roof access. We know firearms had been smuggled into the prison. We know the inquiry found serious failures, and we know the official conclusion rejected state collusion. But the human mind still stops at one question: how? How does a prisoner like Billy Wright get killed inside the maze? How does a prisoner holding rival paramilitary factions allow these many weak points to exist at once? How does a known target become accessible to known enemies? How does a weapon enter a prison building for a high-risk prisoner? And how does a system recover trust after something like this? That is why the Billy Wright case remains powerful for a documentary. It is not just about Billy Wright. It is about what happens when the state takes control of a person's body, movements, and safety. Because once a prisoner cannot protect himself, the institution must protect him. That duty does not depend on whether the prisoner is a killer or liked. It does not depend on whether the prisoner has enemies or he deserves it. The rule is simple. If the state locks the door, the state holds the duty. And on that December morning, that duty failed. Picture the scene while aside. Not the whole prison, not the politics, not the years of conflicts, just the van. A prison van sitting in the forecourt of H Block 6. Inside it, Billy Wright is waiting to be taken to a visit. He is behind prison walls, behind fences, inside a controlled system. In theory, there should be no way for his enemy to reach him. But above him, across the roof line, the danger is already moving. The attackers have found the gap, the cut fence, the reachable roof, the weak routine, the blind spots, the moments. And by the time the system reacts, it is too late. That is the haunting truth of Billy Wright assassination. It was not a killing on an open street. It was not an ambush in a dark alley. It happened inside a prison, inside custody, inside a place designed to control every door, every movement, every risk. And still the assassination happened. The inquiry later said the murder should never have happened. The government said there was no collusion. But the report also made something clear. Failure does not need to look like a secret plan. Sometimes failure looks like ignored danger, bad decision, broken system, weak supervision, missing safeguards, and a deadly opening that should never have existed. Billy Wright's life was defined by the violence of the Troubles. But his death exposed something else entirely: a prison system under pressure, a peace process surrounded by enemies, and a secure jail that one crucial morning was not secure enough. So now the question is not only who killed Billy Wright. That part is known. The deeper question is this: when a prisoner is placed in the protective custody of the state and his enemies still reach him inside one of the most secure prisons in the country, is that just failure, or is the kind of failure that history never fully closes? Because the maze prison is gone now. The H blocks are silent, but the questions from that morning still remain. How did Three prisoners crossed the line between custody and assassination. How did a high security prison become the scene of a killing? And how many warnings had to be missed before Billy Wright was left sitting in that van? This was not just the murder of a prisoner, it was the moment one of Britain's most famous prisons became the crime scene. And decades later, the official answer still leaves behind a shadow. Not collusion, according to the inquiry, but failure. A failure so serious that it changed life, fueled relation, and left one of the most disturbing prison security scandals of the Troubles burned into history.